Mormon Mental Health Podcast is a production of the Open Stories Foundation and relies on donations from its listeners like you. To help keep this podcast alive, please consider becoming a monthly subscriber. Any amount will make a difference. You can click the right-hand donate button on mormonmentalhealth.org. All contributions are tax-deductible within the United States and go towards podcast production and building community support and program development for Mormons on various paths and journeys. Thank you for listening. Hello and welcome to a kind of co-production podcast interview between Mormon Sex Info podcast and Mormon Mental Health podcast. And before I even get started, I'd like to just give a few announcements. So I have some upcoming retreats, one in particular, beginning of March, that has to do with those transitioning in their faith and want to kind of have a positive relationship with Mormonism. So if you're interested in that, please consider going to my website, natashaparker.org. where you can get more information. And I also have in May coming up some supervision training that I'll do for those interested in becoming sex therapists. If you happen to be a mental health professional and interested in that, I'll be presenting with Dr. Stephanie Bueller at the Bueller Institute in California. So please reach out to me if that's of interest to you as well. And then I just want to also just kind of give you a breakdown of both podcasts. So Mormon Sex Info is a podcast where I generally interview professionals and or individuals who've gone through something of note that can offer a little bit more personalized understanding of some of the issues around sexuality that tend to typically come up in Mormonism. And tonight very much fits that boat. I'm super excited to be interviewing Matt Fullmer, and he went through sex addiction treatment, which is something that I find that's very common amongst a lot of my clientele. But what I have not found common at all is people who want to talk about it on a podcast in public. So this is like really huge because I've kind of been waiting for years to be able to do this. And I'm so thankful that we'll be able to kind of delve into this topic tonight with Matt. In order, if you want to support my work at Mormon Sex Info, most of the podcasts cost $1.25 to download, which I feel is very cost effective. Or you can get a $35 year subscription where, somewhere between 30 to 40 podcasts are released every year. That's my goal. And if you want to support my work there, then that's greatly appreciated. As far as those of you who are supporting the Mormon Mental Health podcast, that's only through fundraising that it gets supported. So if you're a donor, if you find my work valuable there, please consider donating. I know that there's a lot of emphasis on supporting female podcasters in the Mormon world, and I'm trying to get better at asking for help around that issue. I love doing the Mormon Mental Health podcast. We cover all kinds of topics around mental health. Sexuality is one of them, and I can't keep it sustainable unless I have support. And so $5,000 a year is about the support we need to just keep it kind of maintaining just for basic costs. But if I want to really be able to pay everybody who's involved, like my editor and even my own time, then we're looking more like an $8,000 to $10,000 podcast cost per year. So if you want to support cause that you feel brings value to your life, please consider a donation. And you can do that at mormonmentalhealth.org. There's a nice little button where you can do a one-time donation or even, kind of like a monthly donation, and any little amount really adds up. So thank you so much for that. All right, so without further ado, the topic that we're going to talk about tonight, I've done a lot of research on it. I've done a lot of thinking about it. I've done a lot of interviews about it, especially with professionals, because it just kept coming up over and over and over again in my practice, both with those in particular in Mormonism who tend to watch pornography. Typically, I would say that's the majority. Sometimes it would deal with other types of sexual behaviors, such as strip clubs or seeing a sex worker, things like that. But for the most part, I would say 95% of the cases that came through my office with a Mormon clientele were men who watch pornography and their wives or partners who are extremely upset and feel very betrayed and awful that this was happening, usually in secrecy, usually not in a contracted way where the wife knew about it. So that was a very stereotypical presentation. This doesn't mean that there aren't times when it's the woman who is looking at pornography. This doesn't mean that there aren't other issues, but this, I would say, is the primary type of presentation that would show up. And at the time when I started noticing this showing up, which was about, probably 12 or 15 years ago, there wasn't a lot of information about it. I was, trying to see what type of research there was. And I definitely came across the sex addiction modality, even went to a few conferences, saw Stephanie Carnes present. She's the daughter of the founder, Patrick Carnes, and bought some of the books and kind of, thought myself through that, saw some red flags or problems even from the get-go back then. And then as I started looking into it, have come across a lot more red flags. So I want to start off today actually giving just kind of a 5-minute overview of my take so that you know kind of my perspective as I'm going to be questioning Matt. Some of the things that I want you to be listening to, because oftentimes what I find is that when I say things like, sex addiction is not an effective modality of treatment, or sex addiction isn't even a diagnosis, what oftentimes happens is the wife or the partner feels very dismissed. Like, what you're saying then is that I shouldn't be upset, that anything goes, that I should be okay with whatever my partner wants to do, or my husband. And that's really not what I'm saying at all. And so I want to be very clear about what my intentions are, because I feel like this modality actually harms everybody involved, including the wife and the partner. And actually, in more distressing cases, actually takes away the accountability or responsibility, because in legal cases in particular, if there's been some type of assault or even pedophilia or things of that nature, they can use this kind of addiction language to excuse behavior. Like, well, they're an addict. What do you expect? They can't really control themselves, et cetera. And so it's very, very concerning to me on many levels. And it's not just about anything goes, and then I'm trying to be porn friendly or anything of that nature. So I'm going to just give you some quick bullet points, and then hopefully we'll have an organic conversation with Matt where he can kind of decide, whether or not some of these points that I'm making fit his experience. So one is that I think that the sex addiction model is problematic because it conflates immoral behavior with diseased behavior. So in any type of religious structure, you have a right to your values, your morals. If you want to say, hey, I believe that we shouldn't be having sex before we're married, or hey, I believe that we shouldn't be looking at sexually explicit materials, or hey, I believe that these things, interfere with my keeping the principle of the law of chastity. Anybody and everybody has the right to do that. And even outside of Mormonism, right? So people who dress in certain ways or have different type of standards of modesty or different types of rules around sexuality. I can think of Orthodox Judaism. I can think of Islam. I can think of several religions that even differ from our own in kind of guidelines around sexuality. And people have a right to that. However, if you don't keep those types of standards, that doesn't necessarily mean that you're sick. So for example, most of us believe we should pay tithes, right? But if you're not paying your tithing, you're not then going to a mental health therapist or a medical professional and getting treatment for non-tithe paying disease, right? And so this is kind of where we have a right to our morality and to our beliefs and values. That doesn't automatically make it a clinical problem. And that's been something that I've been really, really careful about in my work, especially with my own biases coming from a Mormon background and also my training as a mental health professional and a clinician. Number 2 point is we use and refer oftentimes in the church to entities that have not had efficacious results and that do not use treatment modalities that have been deemed best practice by the larger mental health community. So for example, if you're diagnosed with clinical depression, we have some very clear best care standards of treatment of what might help with that type of problem. So whether it's cognitive behavioral therapy, whether it's an exercise program, whether it's certain types of medications. And we know the professionals that have done a lot of research and who've been tested to make sure that that type of treatment is efficacious and that can show that if the insurance company is going to pay for that, that hopefully that type of treatment is actually going to show results. That is not the case with sex addiction modalities. So there is no research to really show that people are coming out of these programs or treatment modalities cured or doing better or, having better sex lives or anything along those things. So the research really doesn't support the treatment. So that's a problem, because if you've got cancer, I want you to get chemotherapy, right? If you've got diabetes, I want you to get insulin treatment. If you have an issue with your sexuality or your sexual relationship, I want you to get treatment that's going to be efficacious and that's going to help you meet the goals and the relational goals that you have as an individual or couple. Number 3 is that we take people in this language and their partners into a disease model that now lasts the rest of their lives in regards to their sexuality. So addiction in our current culture of understanding kind of how we talk specifically about substance abuse disorder like alcoholism. So once you're an addict, and I'm guessing you can finish that sentence for me if you're listening, always an addict for the rest of your life. So with certain substances, that has been shown to actually possibly be true. And even there's some question as to whether or not that's absolutely true. With sexuality, that's actually not shown to be true at all. And so we are inserting both individuals and their partners, who are usually treated as the enablers or the codependents or whatever role you play as a partner, into this model where you now have a relationship as a couple with your sexuality that's diseased for the rest of your marriage and your relationship. And I find that extremely unethical and difficult to handle, that's happening within the mental health profession. What this also does is that it brings about policing and parenting dynamics that usually very much kill the erotic energy within a couple. So you're really focusing on, well, did you not do this? Do we have certain filters on the computer? You need to, tell me certain amounts of things that you're doing or not. It just creates this very kind of problematic dynamic that is just an erotic killer. Okay, number 4 issue, and I kind of referred to this before, is that in the criminal system, this language of addiction actually contributes to less accountability and responsibility for those who are actually using their sexuality in ways that are criminal. And so that's highly concerning to me that sentences have been lowered. Some people just don't even have a sentence altogether. They go to, these sex addiction treatment centers instead of to jail, which again, the sex addiction treatment centers are not shown to be efficacious and are definitely not meant to help very problematic things such as pedophilia or types of criminal sexual assault that people need very specialized treatment for those types of issues. Even as a certified sex therapist myself, I refer out because that's not a specialty even within the sex therapy field that I've specialized in. So to have people who are involved in the criminal system just be sent to these centers as part of their treatment is highly, highly concerning to me and should be concerning to all of us in the safety of our communities. And then number 5 point that I want to make is that real issues, so reasons why there may be problematic sexual behavior to begin with, are generally ignored by this modality. So maybe there's a mental health diagnosis, maybe somebody has social anxiety or clinical depression, and that's affecting how their relationship with their sexuality. Maybe you have a personality disorder, like you have narcissistic personality disorder or some type of thing where you lack empathy for your partner, things of that nature. That's not getting addressed. Accurate sexual education is not getting addressed in sex addiction treatment because sex addiction treatment specialists are not trained in sexuality. They're trained in trauma and they're trained in kind of this sex addiction paradigm that one man came up with, not a body of work of people who really agreed that this was the best standard of care for this particular problem. And it highly ignores relational issues because it automatically puts the person who's having the behavior as kind of like the bad guy, the person who's upset about the behavior as the good guy, and then the whole treatment modality is really centered around keeping them in that kind of role instead of really looking at relational dynamics where both people need to look at what role they're playing in the relationship and why these issues have come up to begin with. Now, that's not to say that we're going to blame people for being lied to. It just means, why are we in a relationship where we are being lied to? What's that about? And what do we need to change about that? Again, I've had a very difficult time getting anybody to agree to talk to me publicly, even though I've had many, many people in Matt's similar situation where they've gone to group therapy, individual therapy, couples therapy, treatment centers, even inpatient treatment centers, which can cost tens of thousands of dollars. I've had people who've mortgaged their home, who have taken out life savings for these kinds of treatments that, again, show no positive results. And I feel like we as a Mormon population are vulnerable. We are vulnerable to this type of treatment. So this is why I get very protective of my Mormon people, because we do have these high standards of sexuality. We do have a lot of morality around sexuality. We have a lot of ideas about how do we want to live our sexual lives. And when our behavior doesn't follow suit, then we become a vulnerable population for this type of treatment modality to set in. And I've seen this because I know bishops and stake presidents currently refer to a lot of these types of treatment modalities. We basically have the treatment modality in our own system. So we have these church they're church addiction groups, which primarily, in my experience, are men who are dealing with pornography that are in those types of addiction groups, or masturbation. Okay, now what this podcast is not about, just to be clear, I'm not trying to convince you to change your values or morals in regards to your sexuality or sexually explicit materials. I'm not trying to say porn is fine, what's the big deal, why even care about it? You have a right to your values, and I'm not here to change that. I'm also not here to, number two, dismiss what I think is very significant, real, valid pain and heartache that comes from the scenarios where one partner has acted in contradiction to what the assumed contract was in the relationship, which usually means there was secrecy. Usually, again, in this case, a wife doesn't know that a husband was looking at pornography or masturbating, feels very betrayed by that, feels left out of sexual decisions, feels like the husband has made a lot of unilateral decisions about their sexual lives together, and feels very betrayed by all of that process. So that's a very real, valid concern. And I'm not trying to dismiss that. In fact, I'm trying to treat that. I'm trying to actually hold people responsible for that in a different modality of treatment that's much more effective. I'm not trying to state that sexual behavior can never be dysfunctional. So any human behavior can be dysfunctional. We overeat, we oversex, we overspend, we do all kinds of things with human behavior that doesn't always fit our values or standards of how we wish we would behave ourselves. So, and sometimes this does necessitate some type of treatment, and finding the right type of treatment is hugely important in helping people meet their goals, and to also help relationships stay intact. And number four, I want to reinstate that this does not mean that I think anything goes. So anyway, that's my little kind of pre-interview scenario as to how I'm approaching this issue as a clinician that's been very passionate about finding out how to really help people through these scenarios for at least 15 years. Given that, I'd like to introduce Matt. So hello, Matt.
Hi.
I'm so glad you're joining me today. I can't thank you enough.
Well, I'm the guy, and I guess I'm the one that's here speaking for the many silent masses that I know are out there. In talking with family members about coming on and talking with you about this, my brother's statement was like, "Bro, this isn't what you want on your tombstone. Like this isn't what you want to define you." And I do. I do recognize that is a touchy subject. One of the reasons why I really feel grateful is that I think I have as I went through the experiences that I went through, I perceive them from my background. And my background is that of, I have a bachelor's degree in chemistry, which is very heavily research-based. Where it's rigorous in its demand for where you get your conclusions. And then as I went on to dental school, I'm a dentist, and further in dentistry, It was the scientific method was reinforced of where you come up with your treatment modalities. There's I don't want to go through a history of medicine, but you don't have to look back very far to realize one of the signers of the Declaration of Independence regularly was bloodletting people. I mean, you can go through these bad modalities that and perceptions that people have, and science is one of the only ways that we can really get away from that. So that's sort of my background. So as I went through therapy, I was kind of like, and I started putting pieces together and seeing areas where it didn't make sense. And as I started really, I did one thing that a lot of people don't do, and that is when I went through these therapies, I 100% followed their, I trusted these people. And I really trusted them. I trusted them with my family, with my marriage, with my life, literally. And I was really disappointed. You touched on a couple of things that I found out right away. Number one is like, it just didn't seem like it worked. The things that they were talking about just didn't seem to make sense. I didn't see any evidence for it. And so anyway, just to start what I do feel grateful that I'm kind of the nerd that went through it, and I can maybe give a voice to something. And I think this is things that you already know, but people don't talk out about it very much. So this is I just wanted to give a quote of why I wanted to share something today. This is out of He Restoreth My Soul. This is a common sex addiction book that is given to anybody that is a lot of bishops hand it out, and it looks really credible, and this is one of the things that's confusing about this is it's written by a doctor, Donald Hilton, MD, and he uses a lot of big words, and he talks about neuroscience. And I mean, the first time I read it, I was really convinced, wow, there's so much science behind this. But it wasn't until you really start digging into a lot of the fundamental research articles where it unravels really quickly and you realize that there really isn't science supporting it. But the one thing that made me want to speak out and feel like I have a great opportunity to make a difference, this is a quote off of page 8 of this book, where he's talking about in this book where he talks about sex addiction and some of the goals. It says, is it okay if I read this quote?
Absolutely, yes.
Okay. I've got 4 kids, and this just makes me sick when I think about this. It says, while we have emphasized prevention, and he's talking about prevention of pornography exposure, putting filters and things on the internet. It says, while we have emphasized prevention in the past and should continue to do so, we must also recognize that virtually all of our young men and many of our young women are already seriously exposed and are therefore already in need of treatment. And that's the real dangerous pill, that exposure, if you look at these things and if you have looked at them and there's they consider you exposed, and that, and you use that term conflate. That is conflation. It just means to take one thing and then just add more things together to it. And I mean, it goes from, it's amazing how here he just says, hey, if a teenager's looked at pornography, he needs to be in sex addiction treatment. And to me, that is a horrific, disgusting, that is so irresponsible. With the science that I now understand, the lack of science, that is so, I just really worry about where this is going, that it's still something that's growing, and there's really not science behind it. So that's basically what I just wanted to share tonight as we go through, is just, however I can help to just, bring the truth, the truth, and not, I don't know, people just don't question it. I went in it, I didn't question it. And it wasn't until we were really in a mess that I realized that there were some real problems with it. So.
Okay, so we're going to definitely hit on a lot of those things that you talked about, because it sounds like one of the things that you're very concerned about is how young people in particular, and I think this happened to you as well, start self-identifying as
Yeah.
sick or, addicts or things of that, and the type of impact that has on your life. So why don't we start off maybe by just having you tell a little bit of your Mormon story. So how
Okay.
did you come to be a Mormon to begin with? And maybe along with that, maybe talk a little bit about what you were taught about sexuality in that regard as well.
Okay. Yeah. So I'm a many generation Mormon family. There's a Fullmer that's a relative in the Doctrine and Covenants. I had ancestors that visited Joseph Smith in Carthage. There's a Fullmer Street in Nauvoo. Fulmers go all the way back. I had a polygamist or a plural wife. There was a plural wife named, I'm spacing her name, but a Fullmer that was married to Joseph Smith. So Mormon history goes back a long way with my family. And the church has been really good. I grew up in the church and I enjoyed primary. I was just the kind of kid that always wanted to help out people. And so I liked service projects and I liked getting together and helping people out. And so the church was good. We had family home evening, and my family was probably they just led with their hearts. I mean, just great people. My parents are amazing examples of I think Christ-like love and charity, just serving the community. I served a mission in Oregon. I loved it. Just had a lot of fun. It was, I think like a lot of people, I took the calling, and this is kind of where it could be. I took the calling really seriously, and I worked hard, and I wanted to be, everything God wanted me to be, and I really loved it. I came home from my mission, and started working towards a degree. Jumped right into school, working really hard, and just ended up getting. I met the love of my life that was right next door. And we bumped into each other, and it was just kind of funny because both of us were just so driven, but we just found each other. We got married pretty quickly in the Salt Lake Temple, and we just ended up going to school, and I ended up getting my chemistry degree here in Kansas, and then went to dental school in Kansas City. And I've had a dental practice. I'm a general practice dentist. I have my own practice here in Topeka, Kansas for about the last 9 years. So
awesome. So as you're growing up, I mean, so one thing I like to ask is, in general, what type of family did you come from? And what I mean by that is kind of on the rigidity flexibility scale of Mormonism, right? So you've got the families that like they can drink Coke products, and doesn't really matter if you stay in your Sunday clothes on Sunday, and you can even watch a football game on Sunday, right? And then you've got the families where no carbonation, no caffeine, very, much more rule abiding in that regard. How would you classify your family of origin growing up?
Yeah, I mean, we wouldn't lose sleep over Coke or I never had a drink of alcohol in until I was in my 40s. I lived the word of wisdom. But it wasn't. I don't know. I guess I wasn't really rebellious, but my parents weren't really. They weren't. I don't want to say they're strict. I'm trying to think of my parent. How would my parents feel if I? But I mean, they're very loving. I would say they taught like the spirit of the law more than the letter of the law.
Okay. Yeah, and that's kind of what I'm getting at. So
yeah. So definitely.
Right. So even given that, your personality seems like it went not necessarily full blown to the letter of the law, but like when you mention your mission, and even probably some of these things as you're starting to deal with your sexuality as a young teen, do you feel like it was very important for you to kind of follow all the rules, all the guidelines to kind of be perfect in a way? that became somewhat problematic when you're dealing with a fairly robust or cyclical sex drive, I'm guessing from a fairly young age, like 11,
Right.
12,
Yeah.
13. Like, start talking to me about what was it like for you when you started noticing your own sex drive?
Well, so I would say I um, the I would say that I was pretty, I don't know, pretty normal, I guess, in talking about normal. Well, I guess this is the thing. What I now see as normal at that time, if I could go back and tell that 13-year-old kid, that would be in a different situation. But at the time, I think the first time I ever masturbated, I was around 13, somewhere around there. And I can remember feeling just that it was horrible, that I had done something terribly wrong, and I knew that I had to go and talk to the bishop about it, and I had to confess, and
How did
I
you know that what you had done was so wrong? Like, what messages were you getting that made you believe that?
Well, the law of chastity is pretty black and white. I mean, it's no sexual relations with anyone other than your husband or wife, and so I really felt like those sexual feelings were, they were bad. Even though some people, I had some teachers that would kind of tell me, these are good, healthy things as long as you're married. But that's it. I was a teenager, and so I really felt like I'd done something terribly wrong, for sure.
So even though you had teachers who tried to normalize sex drive as something positive, the idea that it was really only in the setting of marriage that it was okay to have those types of feelings.
Yeah.
Still feeling very guilty and ashamed.
Yeah, I guess looking back, it's the doctrine. Like what's written, what's written in the principles of the Mormon theology, are the things that really stood out to me. Somewhere in my teenage life, I remember I was given the miracle of forgiveness by a bishop. I want to say it was around 14 or 15. And, there's a chapter in there. The first chapter, if you go and confess to the Mormon bishop, back in the 90s, I think it was pretty common that people just gave out the miracle of forgiveness to a lot of people. It was a book written by Spencer W. Kimball. And in that book, it's the bishop tells you to read it, and so that you understand that what you've done was really wrong. And even though they called it the miracle of forgiveness, there's a chapter right in there that says the sin next to murder, and it lists sexual sin, and masturbation is mentioned right in there, and it says that it approaches, the way that it's phrased in there, sexual sin approaches the unforgivable. And then they go in and they explain a bunch of different ways in that book that really, even if you do repent later, sexual sin isn't really, you're really never clean. Does that make sense? Like, I've heard analogies. I never heard these when I was a kid, but I mean, people that talked about, you were just defiled, and you never get that virtue back. You never get that purity. You'll never be, when you get married, you'll never be as wonderful of a gift to your significant other as you could. And so I definitely, even at a really young age, that really hit me hard. And the other thing is that people don't, and you said, the first thing you said on your podcast, that people don't talk about it. And so what that does as a young kid, and you're feeling that you've committed this sin next to murder, here you are, and I'm this young teenager, and I feel like, wow, I've done these terrible things. And I really didn't have the capacity to process it. And over time, the guilt and the shame and you know, it just really ate at me. You know, it really did. It really caused a lot of problems.
If you had to kind of, I guess for the sake of time, just kind of wrap it up into a few paragraphs, how would you say you entered your marriage in regards to your own sexual identity, how you felt as a sexual being, the types of things that you were worried about? I mean, I think you had mentioned that you weren't necessarily having sex with people during your teenage years, but you were masturbating and looking at maybe erotic imagery.
Yeah, the internet was up, and you know, you could, but it just that wasn't really a huge thing. I mean, yeah, I probably in my whole teenage years, I'd seen a handful of things that you would call pornography, but it was just with intermittent masturbation. I'd feel so guilty about it, feel shameful, go talk to the bishop. You know, it wasn't something that happened really often, but it just made me feel so horrible.
How often would you say you were masturbating as a teen?
Like I'm sure there was times where it was more frequent, but I mean, honestly, once a month maybe. And there would be definitely stretches of time where it would go for months. And as I got closer to going on a mission, the pressure to be pure starts, like, hey, you have to be ready to be a servant of the Lord. And I started feeling a whole lot of pressure to be perfect. And even if you'd go, months at a time and not have any problems, you would just feel tremendous guilt.
Right. So just to recap and to make kind of, again, to remember this idea of conflating morality with clinical type of ideas. If I'm going to take off my Mormon hat, and just look at it from a clinical perspective. So a young man's sexual drive is very cyclical, just like eating, it's a drive, it's a physical drive, shows up usually at that age, anywhere from a few times a day to a few times a week. The American Pediatric Association has had it on their, position statements that masturbation is a very normative bodily function. Most humans do it. Most humans at that age do it daily, maybe even several times a week. And yet you have these Mormon young men like yourself and young women, but again, we're talking about young men right now, that, will kind of stop themselves from behaving in this way for weeks at a time, days at a time. Maybe not completely, not 100%, right? But any type of masturbation,
right, yeah,
is then still seen as sinful and needing of repentance. And so you can see how these standards, so putting my Mormon hat back on, these Mormon standards are not necessarily, they're different than what's considered normative human behavior.
Right.
And so now we're asking people to abstain from normative human behavior. And not only that, kind of buy into this idea that you're broken somehow, that there's some type of issue that's wrong with you. And for many people, this starts a clinical relationship with their sexuality, because I know maybe not in your case, but a lot of young men are referred to either addiction centers, groups like Sons of Helaman,
right,
several things out there that have these young men that maybe are masturbating a few times a week to a few times a month, maybe looking at some erotic materials, and now being treated as clinically diseased.
Right. I definitely felt that. I definitely felt diseased. I felt like I was the only person. Looking back, I just wonder, why wouldn't the bishop, and I think I know why, but I mean, I wonder why the bishops wouldn't say, hey, listen, Matt, every young man comes in here and talks to me about this, or, a huge percentage, because they have to know that. I mean, a bishop has to know that statistic, just knowing. But I think they don't tell you that because they want you to think that it's possible, right? They want you to think that it is possible for you to not behave this way. And so, I don't know, I just see that I really believe like I was the only person and everybody else and was perfect. And so I kind of had that shame in that way.
Mm-hmm.
By the time my mission came close, it just got so bad that the shame and the guilt, and I just felt like, you're given your patriarchal blessing in there, and the blessing says, you're supposed to be an emissary for God, and it gives you all these, if you're worthy, if you're good, and if you live righteously, here's all these blessings that you'll get. And I just remember thinking at 18, wow, my life is over. I've already ruined my whole life. And literally, I was still a virgin. I'd had a little bit of adolescent, whatever you call adolescent fun, but I definitely was still a virgin by the time I was getting ready to be on my mission. And so all of this guilt was over just the shame that they put on masturbation alone. And I became suicidal at about age 19, between 18 and 19. I didn't realize this until just recently, but I started cutting, or self-harming, just because I felt so, and I couldn't really even explain why, but it was just so much guilt and shame that it just was really piling up on me. And I did get some counseling from a non-LDS counselor who was, I honestly don't remember a lot about what we talked about, but I kind of just decided, hey, suicide isn't the way to do it, isn't the right route. So I just as well try to make something out of my life. And I kind of just turned away from that. But then I went on to just work real hard on my mission.
Okay, so just to recap, it sounds like at this point of your life, you are seeing yourself as a broken individual who has sinned almost to the point of being considered as bad as a murderer,
right?
With implications that will affect the rest of your life, even though what you're reporting as far as why you were feeling this way is considered completely clinically normative behavior in all of human beings by medical associations. And this left you feeling shamed, because I'm guessing, you're feeling this drive, I'm guessing on a fairly recent or fairly regular level. So you're having this kind of ongoing cyclical pattern where I'm guessing it goes something like, I'm, horny, or, kind of titillated. It would be nice to feel that release. Most of the time you're fighting against that feeling. Every now and then you give into it. It gives you that immediate pleasure. And then I'm guessing right after it, tons of shame and guilt.
Yeah.
Many of the times that shame and guilt lead you to the office of the bishop, where you talk about that. So then that becomes a repetitive pattern, this kind of ongoing confessional throughout your adolescent years with a mentor, or, somebody who you look up to, who represents really God himself, telling you, yes, Matt, this is something you need to really take seriously and get over and do better on. Here's some tools like the miracle of forgiveness, which makes you even feel worse about yourself. You're now finding yourself to the point of distress where you're considering ending your own life, self-harm, and a lot of crappy ways of thinking about yourself. And you're a virgin. And this is why I try not to be enraged, and why I started speaking up about this publicly was not so much my adults, it was my teenagers that came in time and week after week doing exactly these same things. In fact, I got to the point where I would just flat out ask them if it was masturbation that was causing this, and they would always be shocked because, again, nobody was talking to them about it.
Yeah.
And it was 95% of the time that was what was causing the problem.
Well, and the adults that do talk to them about it do not, they intentionally withhold that normative information.
They don't normalize
most of the adults understand, hey, this is a thing, kids do this. Like, they don't want to say the word normal, though. They don't want to say the word normal. And in fact, I don't understand. I can tell you, I've talked to bishops, I've talked to stake presidents, I've talked to just it's amazing how many people I talk to, and it's like they all kind of, when I kind of talk about this story, they're like, yeah, that's normal, and but for the person, that's the reason why I wanted to speak out, is because somewhere out there's a kid that's been told the same things I was told, who's suffering the same way that I suffered, who is just thinking they're broken, they're horrific, and really they're normal. I mean, that's just normal part of sexual development. But we're not taught sexual development. We're not taught sex educate. Sex education, they is a bad thing. And now that I know that it's really a normal part of human development, that it's healthy.
Yeah. Well, and I want to just say a few things. So I noticed that in the last 2 weeks, I think it's been about 2 weeks, the church actually came out with something around pornography. So I quite frankly have not had the time to look at it because I was traveling overseas, but I just want the audience to know that I have a panel of sex therapists where we're committed to look at that website and see, what we think is helpful or not helpful. I've heard a few positive things about it already, but I just really can't comment on it. So I'm excited to delve into it and see what it has to offer. Sometimes when the church, does things like that, it can be really great in some ways. In other ways, it can kind of continue some of the patterns that we're concerned about from a clinical standpoint. So I just want to just be open about that I haven't really had time to look into it. Another thing I want to just mention before we move forward is I see that there's several of you watching. Please feel free to ask questions. Please feel free to make comments if you agree or, have similar experiences yourself. And you can do that. So I know I've shared it on several of my pages, but this is broadcasting from the Mormon Sex Info page. So make sure you're watching it if you want to make comments that I'm going to see and be able to address comments or questions. You should be posting that on the Mormon Sex Info thread, which is public and everybody should be able to access. Okay, so let's delve into then, Matt, how this starts showing up in your marriage. So you go ahead and you come back from your mission, you start going to school,
so
get married.
I went through my mission, and actually I was just so busy. I went the whole 2 years without having a problem with masturbating or anything. So I was really happy with that. Coming home from my mission, exactly what's really common is, you isolate yourself from so many things, movies and media, and there's a lot of sexuality out there in the world. And I did slip back a little bit, but it was just.
And slip back meaning?
Yeah, I masturbated a couple of times after my mission and before I got married.
Right.
And
so I note that because I just want to, I want people to understand how easy it is to slip into that language. So slip up, again, it's fairly normal for people to masturbate. And yet, you are calling it a slip up because that's the language it's used.
Right.
And it's addictive language too, right? Like falling off the wagon, getting sober, all of these terms are used in sexuality. So I just wanted to point that out.
But I did, in talking with other people about it, I think this whole process was much more painful to me because I was extremely honest, honestly. And so I was honest with my bishops, and most of the people that I talk to, they have stress and because they're hiding it, they're from their bishops. I didn't have that feeling like I was, I always felt like I was right. I was being a good Mormon because I always talked to my bishops, and I always had a temple recommend, and that never seemed like it was a threat. So
in some ways, the confession piece helped you feel like a better Mormon. Like at least you were being honest, which is one of the big values of Mormonism, right? Is honesty. Yeah. Whereas you talk to men who say a big part of the shame is that they weren't being honest. They didn't want to go through that confessional process. They were keeping it to themselves.
Right. Yeah. So I got married, and things were great, and I didn't have any problems with masturbating. And then when we reached a point where my wife's career got really busy. And I mean, it was sort of our first struggle in our marriage, because she was busy and gone and I felt neglected. And, you know, I mean, I don't want to justify it, but I started masturbating occasionally. And, you know, I just felt like, you know, I felt like it was, she was stressed, and I felt like, you know, pressuring her for sex sometimes would be something that would cause more stress for her. So in some way I rationalized it that way.
So even though there were possibly some positive implications of you masturbating, like dealing with different libidos or different stress levels of different wants, it wasn't something that you were contracting with her. It wasn't something that you were talking about.
Yeah, I didn't have any, and I should say that if I feel like I'm, you know, I understand that this is a really hard issue and there's a lot of emotion on it. My heart goes out to, you know, my wife that dealt with this, or my ex-wife, and, you know, anybody that's in that situation. It can be a really tough thing. And a lot of times you just don't have good tools of how to deal with it. Yeah, I definitely would have been. I see the importance that it was something that we should have talked about right away. What I did do, though, is within just a few weeks of having made those mistakes in my marriage, I confessed to her. I went to the bishop and then I confessed to her, because, like I said, I was pretty honest with her right from the get-go. And that was devastating. She was devastated. Absolutely.
So I want to just say right up front, again, mainly to the audience, is that there's people out there that would say, you know, if you want to masturbate as an individual, your spouse doesn't even have a right to have an issue with that. Like, there's that camp. Okay. Again, not a Mormon camp, but just there's that camp out there that will say we all have a right to like our own thoughts, our own bodies. You as my partner don't have a right to tell me whether or not I should masturbate. So there's definitely that kind of spectrum. And then there's, of course, the spectrum where anything, you know, that happens sexually, whether it's masturbation, even fantasy, thought we should be, you know, discussing and talking about as a couple. That's coupled sexuality, and it belongs to kind of both of us, and we need to negotiate that. I think sexual negotiation is very important to avoid some of these devastating scenarios. And I agree with you that we really don't have narratives in Mormonism or scripts that people know how to use that. Because again, these things are usually seen as you should not be doing them at all, even in marriage, or even though we have in Mormonism this idea that a couple should decide together what their sex life is going to look like. And I've helped people negotiate things like masturbation in ways that are very helpful to them and edify their relationship. And I'm talking about believing active Mormons. It's very hard unless you're comfortable using your own authority and ideas like personal revelation and, you know, kind of that type of stuff to get to that point, because there's nothing that the culture is offering you to know how to do that, like you said. So I can understand why your wife probably would have been devastated, because the script that Mormonism offers you, the contract that Mormonism gives you, is that everything sexual will be between you and me, and there really is no privacy like this camp over here that's even allowed or considered. Is that fair?
Right. Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah. There just wasn't. We had no. I mean, I was 24. She was 21. We, in truth, really had limited relationship experience, and definitely, and I never had a relationship before where you had to manage a sexual relationship at all. So, you know, it's, all those things that you're saying that I have more of an education now that I didn't have then, of just how to realistically deal with those things.
Right.
Yeah.
Okay, so you confess and to your bishop, to your wife. So what starts happening? What trajectory does that start setting you on, both of you?
So this is where the miracle of forgiveness comes back into my life. But now I have a really good set of college study skills on top of where I've had it before. And I dissected that book cover to cover. I believe I'm the only person I've ever heard of that has marked every reference in that book. But that, I mean, that's the kind, when I say that, I realize that it's kind of crazy. It's kind of crazy, but I mean, I was so committed. I was so committed to wanting to be better that I did everything that I could. And unfortunately, what I did is that made it worse in a lot of ways because I was just digesting unforgivable, the sin next to murder, so many quotes about, how horrific sexual sin is. And so that was just a hard one. And I think for me, in some ways, my marriage, that it was over at year 2, even though it went 16, there was a lot of things that just never recovered from there.
What can you expound on that? What do you mean by that it was over at year 2? What were some of the dynamics or processes that were starting to happen that would have you feel that way?
After that point, no amount of church activity or testimony or service or scripture study could ever, in my wife's eyes, make me appear worthy to her.
So not only were you buying into this idea that you were broken and really unredeemable, but she was buying into that as well, that you had crossed some type of line that made your relationship with her kind of unforgivable in a lot of ways, kind of keeping you in the perpetual bad guy territory.
Right. Yeah.
Even though you were doing all these other, were you kind of like a crappy husband? Were you not attending church? Were you being a bad dad? Like what was the rest of your relationship like?
No, I was active, I was active at that. Let's see, at year 2, I had a calling in the young men's organization. We were tithing, paid tithing.
Was she unhappy about other aspects of your relationship? In other words, did she have complaints about you being kind of jerky in other ways? Or was it primarily focused on this disappointment? I guess that's what I'm trying to get at.
I was, and I want to be really careful because she's not here. And I should say, I did tell her that, I was going to talk about this. And so I don't want to say too much in her, but I think I think it's fair enough to say that I think when we got married, she had an expectation that a priesthood holder, like I said, I was very, I don't want to say I was a successful missionary and like brag, but I was a good mission. Like I worked hard. I know the scriptures, I give a good sacrament meeting talk. In church terms, I think that she really, I care about people, just like my parents. I like people. I went into healthcare because I like helping the people in whatever ways. I really care about people. And I really think that she just believed she'd married Jesus. And that's, that's Peter priesthood, whatever name you want to put on it. She had me on a pedestal for sure. Yeah. And
so the fact that you had betrayed her in this way or come down off the pedestal in this sexual way was a huge blow for her. That was hard for her to recover from.
At that time, because, yeah.
Okay. Because I just want to, I know that you can't speak for her and I'm guessing she would have lots of other things and she would complicate the story.
Without question.
But I guess just in general, would you grade yourself, like somewhat responsible, somewhat caring, loving and affectionate, or were you kind of like a jerk?
I'm the kind of guy. Okay, so no, I definitely have screwed up. I have really done some stupid things in my marriage, but without a doubt, I tried 100%. I was the kind of guy that would, for Valentine's Day, I would make like a CD mixtape of our favorite songs. And then like in between, I would record, like I was some cheesy DJ, like, hey, you're listening to K-Love, and I made this mixtape for one Valentine's Day. Another Valentine's Day, I recreated our first date, which was hilarious because it was kind of a catastrophe. I don't know. I really tried to remember birthdays and, be thoughtful in those ways. And
Yeah,
Yeah,
because I think what I'm trying to get at is that there are people in relationships where there's like, five major problems, like they're just disrespectful to each other. They have very poor communication skills. I don't know, whatever. One person's like spending money without the other person knowing what, name it, whatever. My experience working with so many Mormon couples is that this particular topic, if this is happening, if this type of betrayal happens, even when in general the relationship is fairly good in the rest of the categories, they have a fairly good sex life, they have fun together, they go on dates, they parent the kids fairly well, they don't have
hmm
huge, kind of implications in other areas of their relationship, this can still be a huge deal breaker. Because even though all those things are going okay, like you said, this thing is seen as such a huge thing, so unredeemable, so hard to come back from, that it can really kind of color the entire relationship, even though it's one aspect of their relationship. So I'm just wondering, how you would, maybe she would have a different answer than you on that, but how you would say, yeah, this was like primarily the issue, or we had, lots of other issues too.
Yeah, we went through dental school, and we lived, in poverty basically for 4 years, going through as students. I mean, that took a toll, I know. Then years later down the road, starting a business and having a dental practice has been a rough road. I mean, we opened the practice, and then we got embezzled by an employee, and um, it's it's been so we've had some real financial struggles at times, even though we've overall lived a fairly I don't know, I think I'm doing I I feel like we've been successful, but there's definitely some other issues. One of the things that I'm finally starting to address that I never really had an issue of, but I realized that there's, and maybe we'll get to this point later, but one of the big problems with the sex addiction model is that it basically ignores that there could be other mental health issues that are going on. All symptoms that somebody is going through are blamed on pornography. And one of the things that started, sorry, and I laugh about it because I can't cry, but one of the things that got to me is I knew that they were describing, at one point when we were going to a counselor, I knew that they were describing something that was ADHD. It wasn't, and it had been there my whole life, but I didn't know that, I didn't really get diagnosed with ADHD until I was almost 35. And that's just because nobody told me to look for that. They told me go to school and study really hard, and I did. I didn't realize I was studying, twice as much as some of the other people. And I've made it all the way through, 9 years I got a chemistry degree and a dental degree, and I got good grades, and I just worked really hard. But there's a lot of issues that come with that personality type that are tough on relationships. So without question, there's a lot of things about my personality that were really tough on our marriage, that are tough to live with, that without question were issues in our marriage. But I think that a lot of them were just, it was all blamed on the root cause of pornography and,
Okay. So walk us through then how the two of you start getting involved in sex addiction treatment. Was that right from the get-go, 2 years in, when you start kind of this initial?
No, we were so young, we didn't really have the money or the resources to do stuff. And I think that that's really hard. Somewhere around year 7, I remember we had a conversation where she was like, I'm pretty sure you're a sex addict. And that just had to do with frequency. We had differences of opinion about that.
Of libido, in other words, how often?
Yeah, libido differences. And, you start saying, well, what's a normal number? And I think that's not so important now. I would deal with that completely differently now. But,
as far as how you propositioned her for sex, is that what you mean by that? Or
No, well, just that, yeah, that issue of differences of libido, yeah, and how to address that, and I think we just got frustrated, and we each coped with it in a negative way, and we kind of built up resentment, and that went on for another couple of years, and it was about year 13 or 14 where I think my wife then had read something online. She'd found some quiz, and this is very, very common where people find it. She'd found a quiz, and she said, you're an addict. And I remember her saying, you either admit that you're an addict and you get treatment, or we're done.
So very similar to how people like with an alcoholic husband or something like that are taught to kind of respond to something like that.
Yeah.
What was happening in your relationship at that point that she might have thought you were a sex addict? Was it still just a libido difference, or did she know that you were doing things that were not, I guess, contracted between the two of you? As far as you're comfortable disclosing, I don't want you to feel like you have to close everything either.
I think our marriage at that point was just what any marriage would be like when you have the stress of running a business that is very challenging and demanding, and taking care of 4 busy kids, and I think there was just the stress of those 2 things. And then when this issue would come up, she's just like, I'm sick of dealing with this. And that was it was a real deal breaker. And
the issue being, again, that you wanted to have sex with her.
No. The issue was pornography that either I had confessed it to her again, or she had found it. Okay, most of the time, and I told about how honest I was in the beginning, and I stick to that narrative that I was very honest. But eventually, you find that honesty it doesn't give you solutions, and it creates more problems sometimes. So as time went on, I probably was delaying my honesty with her more than I should have when it came to disclosing pornography or whether I'd looked at it. I stayed being honest with my bishop, and I do think I did a pretty good job of keeping her updated about those things. But it just created so much. It was just too much stress and trauma. So,
and again, just from a clinical perspective, are you comfortable sharing what level of frequency you were looking at pornography in somewhat of
probably once a month, but I would go months at a time. I know that there was a stretch in there, in my marriage where it was multiple times close to a year. Yeah.
And I say that because she has a right to be upset that you are continually doing something in your relationship that she either disagrees with or has a different opinion about or wishes you weren't doing. That's really different from addictive or, compulsive behavior, which just, again, from a clinical perspective, if somebody comes in and says, oh, I'm really worried, I'm doing something once a month, unless it's serial murder, I'm not going to be horribly concerned about that, right? Does that make sense?
Yeah. So the addiction model that they say is you can't give it up. It's like an alcoholic who keeps going back to a drink. You're addicted and you can't give it up. And I just remember when she hit me with that, I just remember thinking, this is crazy. This is the most crazy. I can't believe that.
Meaning that you didn't buy into that definition?
Oh yeah, I couldn't believe that when I started reading about when I initially started reading some of the things, I was just like, this isn't controlling my life. I'm not like losing my job. I'm not, I've never had an affair. I've never talked to anybody. I've never, I've been completely what I felt faithful, but that's the thing is they see it as infidelity. The addiction model sees it as infidelity. And, I think people have the right to see it that way if they want to. but yeah,
Well, I do think that there's a difference between betraying each other, lying to each other, not being completely honest, not negotiating, versus having an affair where you go and have a sexual relationship in a physical or even maybe emotional way with another person. There is a spectrum here that's important to differentiate between. Once you start saying everything's infidelity, then you lose some of the, I think, impact of what infidelity can be. So again, I think these get to be complicated conversations because I don't want to diminish her pain and her frustration with you. And at the same time, that doesn't mean it's infidelity, and that doesn't mean it's addiction. And she has a right to be upset about it. And you guys were not negotiating it very well, right?
right,
And so
right,
those all kind of sit at the same table.
right. Yeah. So so she gave me the ultimatum, and my choice was basically divorce or go through these programs. And I said, I will do whatever it takes to save my marriage, And so
in a way, what this model offered your ex-wife was validation for her pain and frustration.
mm-hmm.
And it offered her also like a script. In other words, if I'm going to be a good wife, I need to make you confront this. I need to give an ultimatum. I mean, I really do think this comes honestly. I don't think she was being malicious. I'm guessing she was really trying to better her relationship with you. And this is what this addiction model did, was offer this ultimatum and this definition and this validation that probably, I'm guessing, felt very empowering to her in the moment where she didn't know what else to do.
Right. Yeah. Yeah.
And yet it kind of started a big mess. So can we talk a little bit about that? So what did you do? You entered treatment. Is that correct?
Yeah. Yeah, I did. So, the first thing that is so hard, and you touched on it in your original bullet points, is you have to admit that you're an addict. And putting that label on yourself carries with it so much baggage. I just wept. I mean, I can remember just crying many, many nights, just as I started to realize that I had to not only that admitting this, just admitted that I was all these things that I didn't think that I was. But if you don't think that you're and here's the crazy part about addiction is if you say, no, I'm not that, well, now you're in denial, right? So you have to accept it all. You have to say, yes, I am all that. I'm everything that you say that I am.
So if you challenge the narrative, if you challenge the script, if you have a different idea, then you're put in the denial category, which is even worse than being an addict. Right. Now you're an addict in denial, which means you don't want to take responsibility. You don't want
which means you're choosing to live in your addiction rather than to be with your family, which I think is such a horrible dichotomy, to be put in. But so the first program that I went into was Men of Moroni. That's similar to the Sons of Helaman. It's a group treatment for it. And you just start showing up and you start reading the books that they tell you to read. You have some goals. There's accountability in these groups. It's similar to 12-step in a way. Men of Moroni they don't do a lot of the same things that 12-step does, but there's accountability and there's messages that they teach as you go along.
And so it's obviously a group geared towards Mormon men or Mormon couples with the name. And who were the people who were creating this program? Were they mental health professionals? Were they ecclesiastical leaders? Who were these people?
Maurice Harker is the leader of the Men of Moroni group and the Life-Changing Surfaces. And he, if you could take addiction and then mingle it with scripture a little bit, I think that explains the program pretty well. I mean, even in the way that it's named, you are expecting something that's very church flavored. So that's pretty much what it is. You're reading scriptures, you're reading, there's a textbook called Like Dragons They Did Fight. yeah, you just start reading and you start doing these things. And, real quickly I became sort of a leader. I would lead the groups even after just a couple of months of what they call sobriety. I started leading some groups and teaching some groups and having accountability. My wife became sort of a leader, an outspoken person. And it actually, when we first started in addiction, it gave us something to do. We were really busy, and in some ways it felt like maybe we were getting closer together. But then as the months went on with therapy, it just got worse and worse. And my feeling is that even when I was sober, I was never sober enough, or I wasn't. There was these lists of things that they judged what you were supposed to be doing. And
can you give examples of that? Like what were the expectations?
Well, so what they wanted, what your goal was to get a certain number of days of sobriety by doing your daily checklists, and that gives the spouse, your wife, confidence that they can see that you're working on these goals. We kept these journals. These are just some of the. This isn't all the journals that I kept, but just you keep journals of your daily struggles and things. And so I kept those. And again, I questioned the validity or the effectiveness of some of it right from the get-go, but you just can't question anything. I mean, I asked a couple questions in some of the groups, and people are like, you're never going to get better if you have to put your whole heart into it if you want to succeed. And so I just kind of shoved my doubts down and kept just doing it. And it really wasn't that hard to stay away from pornography and masturbation. What I really just was heartbreaking was just the separation from my wife. I mean, we just grew further and further apart as time went on. And that really hurt.
And you think that was part of the process of going through this treatment together, or that was separate?
Yeah. The women are kind of taught the same thing that the men are about what addicts do. One of the things that came out right away is that all addicts are liars. They lie. And so, and what they lie about is to feed their addiction. And so when your husband said he loved you, he really didn't love you. He just wanted to have sex with you. And
goodness.
As time goes on, you just realize that you're I just realized she looked at me like I thought she was a piece of meat, that she. And here was a woman that we had built a business together. The whole reason we're here in Kansas is because I stopped my education in the middle to help her career. It's her career. She graduated before I did. We both have I sacrificed for her career. I'm we've raised 4 kids together, and it was just shocking to be there at 13 years and literally have to be defending yourself to your wife that you don't think she's just a sex object. Like it was unbelievable to me, unbelievable that I would be fighting for that in her mind,
So really giving a script to the two of you that really puts you at kind of an enemy territory. Like, I can't trust you. Everything that you say to me, I should treat as suspect. And it puts your sexuality in that camp, right? So if I'm sexually interested in you, if I want affection from you, if I want to have a sexual experience from you, that can't be about love, or it's seen as suspect.
Yeah. There was a time where, just some of the other things that there's another doctrine that is really kind of taught. They compare pornography addiction to a drug, right? Like cocaine. And one of the things that they've really shown with cocaine and some of those hard drugs is that they escalate, like they follow a process until basically your life falls apart, right? And so when they make these connections with sex in the same way and pornography, what that's basically telling the spouse or the wife is, this guy that you see right here, he's holding it together right now, but he's holding back like this
like a trajectory that's going to happen that you don't have any control over.
Yes, it's a trajectory, and all, the only thing keeping that from just exploding all over your life is going to meetings, writing in journals, doing these goals, going to sex addiction therapy. Like that keeps. It's like your husband's the Incredible Hulk who just has this massive destructive ability, and the only thing keeping him from destroying you is just all of this therapy. And
that sounds super sexy, super fun way to live your life.
Right. It's super scary.
So just to be fair, I mean, you mentioned some things that were helpful about it at first, and I do think that there are things that are helpful about it at first. I think the sex addiction model offers a treatment plan. It offers hope, right? It says, here's your problem. Now we can fix it. And so I think for a lot of people who are dealing with distress and sadness and frustration, it can feel like a godsend, right? Like, oh, finally, we know what this is. There's something we can do about it. I think for some wives, it can feel like, well, if you're just being a jerk and ignoring my sexual values, I don't know that I want to be with you. But if it means that you're sick, well, I can take care of you if you're sick. So now she becomes a nurse.
No, yeah, she can't take care of them because then you're enabling. So right. Yeah, so that's the other thing that happens is a lot of times any of the niceness that you had up to that point, now once the wife really starts being taught that, oh, I can't enable, he's got to take care of this on his own. I mean, that's just tremendous to have be going through all this, and then to have the person that has been your companion for over a decade just disappear. That was really hard. And
you mentioned that it had some joining potential. In other words, now the two of you are kind of joined at the hip fighting, this monster, right? So
right.
At least initially there was some level of like, oh, this connects us. Now we're on the same page. We're fighting against something together instead of each other. So other than those things, was there anything else that was potentially useful about any of this treatment before we start talking about ways that it wasn't useful? Were there things that maybe were helpful in regards to the time and money and energy that you spent going to all these meetings?
I now know for a fact I'm not the only person who masturbates. I now know that. I know hundreds of men who also have admitted to me that it also has, it's something that has occurred in their life. So, and actually that's tremendously beneficial, is just knowing that other people are going through the same thing that you are. So it was
normalizing.
Normalizing, yes. Everything normalizing so you don't feel like a freak show. Yeah, that undid that for me.
Okay. Anything else? Because I just want to point out that you could have gotten that through effective treatment as well. So that's not unique to this treatment. It was one of the things that you received, but it wasn't unique.
I think like you said, having a plan, just like having some routines. I think, I believe in setting goals but after a while, initially just having something to keep you busy and saying, this is going to work. And I remember writing in my journal, I'd been sober for like 6 months. And I learned that although I wanted to be as honest as possible with my ex-wife, I also learned that being overly open to things that she didn't need to know, like she didn't need to know that somebody walked by in a revealing dress or something like that. Like I literally would confess every single little thing, like, and I'd write that in a journal. I think it was kind of surprising about 6 months in where my ex-wife thought that all of a sudden my problems would go away. And she was really frustrated that, it was work to go through those programs, and it was annoying at times, and it was frustrating, and it was frustrating not being close to her. That was one thing that I never understood. They want these men in these groups to be labeled all these terrible things, to be distanced. Oftentimes people are immediately separated from their spouses, if not divorced, so you're taken away from your family. And then, but somehow if you're doing the program exactly right, you will be at peace, right? And what I understand now is that's insane. Like, take somebody, I don't care how at peace you are, if your family is broken apart, if you're away from your children, if your most important relationship is with your spouse, how you wouldn't feel stress about that. Like, because I kept thinking, man, I'm doing this program, but I'm still really stressed and I'm kind of depressed about it. That was super frustrating. I think my ex-wife was feeling that way too. She was like, I'm doing this program, how come I'm not cured?
Do you feel like there were any types of skills that were being taught as far as sexual negotiation between you and your wife, even sexual education that might help, for example, like with libido differences? You mentioned that you were kind of depressed. Were they looking at depression as a possible thing to treat? Like, what, or was this just really kind of a focused accountability program?
So I'll tell you, the last day that I was with Mena Moroni, I had written in my journal a list of symptoms. And at that point, I had about a year of sobriety. I had been working the program. I had been doing everything that I'd put my whole life. We'd spent thousands of dollars at this point. I wanted nothing. I'd done everything that I could to follow their program. And I remember going to one of the clinicians and saying, listen, I have this list of symptoms and I just want to know, I'm a year sober and I want to know, like, what's causing this. And I'm not joking when I literally went to him with this little list and I said, this is my symptoms. I'm having difficulty sleeping. I'm having difficulty wanting to do the normal daily things that bring me enjoyment, like spending time with friends and socializing, or doing activities that I used to find enjoyable, like, my hobbies. Like, I used to like to go hiking and do stuff in the outdoors. I have radio controlled airplanes and things that I like to do, or even just watching sports, those things. I had lost enjoyment in those things that I like to do. And what was the other one? Lack of sleep, desire for things, just loss of energy and lethargy in general. And I think
classic depression 101.
So don't jump the gun yet, because I literally, I'm not even thinking that. I'm just saying, I'm doing the program. What does this mean? And this was what I was told by the clinician, is they said, pornography is so malicious that it literally changes the brain pathways in your brain. It's permanently damaged. You may never completely heal. And that's why it's so important that you stay the course and just keep working through. And he 100% attributed those symptoms to pornography viewing. And like I said, at that moment, I 100% knew. I hadn't even looked at so much as a Victoria's Secret picture, girl. And that's hard to do. You know how hard that is to avoid any kind of, like, I'm talking about lingering too long on a supermarket tabloid. I mean, it takes a lot of work to just keep your eyes away from everything that's in the world. It's not impossible, and I'm not saying it's not, but it does take work. And I just remember, I can't believe that. I can't believe, because I knew in my life how much I spent thinking about sex and pornography and how much sex was a part of my life. And I was like, this is bull. Like, there's no way. I can't believe that what he's saying is what's the cause of it. So I went right home from that counseling session, and I Googled my symptoms, literally wrote them in, sleep disturbances, lethargy, lack of enjoyment of things that I used to enjoy doing. And it's depression, it's depression. And I just look back at that and I just think, honestly, it's just, you feel betrayed, because how can somebody that you really trust misdiagnose that?
Goodness.
That'd be like somebody, like, for a mental health professional, I just don't see how you miss that diagnosis.
And was he a mental health professional? Was this clinician? Well, was it a clinician? Like, what were the?
He's a licensed clinician. Yeah. Yeah. With a licensed, yeah.
Some type of master's degree at least. And
master's level.
Yeah.
So,
well, which again, to me, this is something that mental health professionals are at odds about. There are licensed mental health professionals that feel very strongly that this is an effective form of treatment, even though there isn't the research to support it. And yet they don't have expertise in sexuality either, right? So when people say, well, Natasha, you're just kind of over on this side, and this person is just over on this side, you guys are both master's level clinicians, that's true. And yet I've gone through like 3 to 5 years of extra specialized, therapy training in sexuality. Whereas sex addiction specialists, it's like a few weeks of a course in sex addiction treatment, which again was, a program that was formulated by one person.
Right.
The program that I went to is governed by a group of, very robust group of therapists from all kinds of different backgrounds that have come up with guidelines and curriculum for what a sex therapist should know before they call themselves that.
Right.
And then sex therapy in general is not regulated as a profession in of itself. So really anybody can call themselves a sex therapist. So I think a lot of therapists come by this issue, honestly. I think I could have very easily gone down the camp of being a sex addictions therapist, especially coming from my background as a Mormon therapist and having my own values around pornography and sexuality and law of chastity and all of that. So I can it's very seducing when a paradigm fits your moral background.
Right.
So you have to be kind of astute, and you have to be ethical, and you have to be really checking your own biases. Something I struggle with, just as everybody else. But if you're not going to get kind of duped, even as a clinician, as a licensed person. So I'm not, a lot of people will say, well, these people are opportunists and, they're just after the money. Well, we're all trying to make money. I think all of us as mental health professionals are trying to make a living. And I think that a lot of mental health professionals come about it honestly, and they really buy into it. And then it becomes kind of this economic cost. It's very hard to change your mind once you're kind of invested and you've spent your own thousands of dollars becoming certified, right, in a certain camp, even though it isn't research supported and evidence-based.
Yeah. Well, yeah, authority, and that's when I started really unraveling a lot of the things that were happening. I realized I was listening to him just because he was an authority, right? So just because somebody has doctor behind their name, because they have a PhD, that unless they have evidence to back up what they're saying, they're giving their opinion, and that's where a lot of this unravels. The science behind it has been, taken from people doing studies on television addiction or video game addiction or those so-called addictions, people that gamble. There's studies on those things that show some correlations, but we don't have the evidence. I don't see the evidence for pornography. There was a big study back in 2013 done in the Navy. I don't know if you've heard about that one. It was widely publicized that, oh my goodness, this is the big research that's proving that that porn addiction is real. And come to find out a short time later that study was redacted from the journal it was published in because there was a bunch of conflicts of interest. They were influencing patients. There was some ethical concerns with the study, and so that was overturned. And so anyway, there's there's been a lot of publicity that there's great science, but there isn't.
Well, the reality is that the sex addiction concern has been, for probably like 2 decades now on the radar, of the people who, come up with all of the research needed to make it into the diagnostic statistic manual, right? Which is where we have our mental health disorders. And granted, that book is never perfect, and there's always issues with it, and there's always has been issues with it, and we continue to improve it, hopefully, as we go. But it's not that it hasn't been considered. It's been very considered for over 2 decades now as its own disorder, sex addiction. Gambling is in there. The other thing that you mentioned, video gaming, is not in there yet, but again, under scrutiny to see if it's something that can become maladaptive to the point of becoming a disorder. So but the problem with video gaming and gambling and how it's different from sexuality is that, and even from food, is that there seems to be something that interferes with satiety. So if you win $1 million as a gambler, that doesn't mean that 2 seconds later, you're still not hitting the same lever, right? Whereas once you ejaculate and kind of masturbate, and you're kind of done, until the next time. You don't see a lot of people kind of going through, ignoring a refractory period in their sexuality. And so the neuroscience just doesn't really, like you're saying, match what we see for kind of how the brain is affected by chemicals, for example, or some of these other probably behavioral compulsive behaviors that can become kind of out of control for people. Now, again, that doesn't mean that people don't act in ways sexually that go against their own values, that they're concerned about. A lot of people will say, I feel out of control in my sexuality, just like people will feel out of control in their eating, when they're spending. And we want to address those issues. We want to help them address those issues. There's a variety of reasons why that could be the case, usually having to do with relational aspects or mental health aspects that we want to uncover and then treat effectively.
Right.
Because there is standard of care for treating an anxiety disorder that might be affecting your pornography use, right? Or depression, or a relational issue, or a libido difference, or there's 500,000 reasons why people might feel out of control.
Yeah, that was one of the big frustrations that I felt, is I just thought, wow, there's all these other things that are happening. I don't know how to explain what they are, but I'm pretty sure it's not sex related. But you can't get off that issue. Once you're labeled as sex addiction, all roads lead to, it's all connected to that. And that's what's really sad is, so to follow up to what I said is, the last time that I met with that sex addiction counselor, I went right to a psychiatrist, and he's like, "Yup, you've got depression." And within a month, I felt, from a 6 to a 9 better, or from a 5 to a 9 better, just night and day difference. And because I was being treated for what my actual symptoms were, which were depression. And that's one of the biggest things that I see. I see a tremendous relationship between people with ADHD, and this is really reaching for me as a dentist, because this is outside my realm. So maybe but I saw all kinds of people with ADHD symptoms that were being blamed on pornography. Mm-hmm. People who struggled. One of the most people don't often know this, but in adults, one of the number one symptoms of ADHD is inability to hold consistent employment. And if I can tell you of at least 3 marriages that have ended because the husband was struggling with employment, it was blamed on pornography, and after they got divorced, nothing got better. And it just makes me it's very sad to see something being blamed that's, and even the people think that, they walk away, they're not diagnosed, they don't even know what they're dealing with, and they just believe that they're a failure and they ruin their life when they have an undiagnosed mental condition. So,
well, what you're describing really sadly is malpractice. I mean, it's really unethical in that regard. And what I want people to understand is that sex addiction is not a diagnosis. So they can't bill under a sex addiction diagnosis. So I don't know what they're billing under, but it's not that. So the diagnosis itself doesn't even exist. So if somebody tells you you have something that doesn't exist, that's malpractice. I just want to give a shout out really fast. So Dr. Nikki Prowse just made a comment on our post, and she made a reference to one of the studies that you were talking about, Matt. So, and she's excellent. She's a neuroscience. She is an expert.
She's doing the stuff that needs to be done. Yeah, she's great.
She's also one of my guests on Mormon Sex Info. So check out her podcast and look her up on Google, because she has some excellent talks out there, and is really doing some phenomenal work around this issue. So, all right. So Matt, we've been at this for almost 2 hours, which is, I knew what would happen. So tell me a little bit about, let's talk then post, so you start getting you got some red flags right at the beginning, but because of this, you're in denial and you're not going to get better. If you stay in denial, you kind of,
you can't escape it.
Yeah. So you kind of were in that feedback loop you can't get out of. And so you retracted some of those, stuffed them away. But as you kept on going, you're a whole year into the process or more. You're a leader even in the groups. Your ex-wife is a leader as well.
I'm a good addict. Yeah,
you're a good addict. Neither one of you are necessarily seeing great improvement in your life. You're still stressed out.
Yeah, despite being a good addict, our relationship it was devastating. It was, it definitely went off a cliff as soon as
you're not having better sex. You're not, having better sexual relationships together as a couple. You're not learning how to negotiate your sexuality as a couple. You're not feeling really energized or better. You're even feeling worse because your depression symptoms are going untreated. Plus, you have all this kind of shame about being an addict. So now you've defined yourself in a way that's very kind of lifelong, in a lifelong altering way. So how do you start challenging this, and where does that lead you? Where are you now?
Well, honestly, I never really did until ultimately it led to things got worse before they got better. And what's so crazy, what makes you feel really crazy is you feel like you're the only person that really understands what's going on. And all the people around you that are supposed to be smart people, like you said, master's degree, they have all these initials, they have doctorates, and you just feel like nobody understands me. Nobody even has a clue about what I'm going through. Like I said, something as simple as you're told, hey, you should be at peace. You should be able to find yourself and be happy by yourself and not be dependent on a woman. And I think that that's a true statement if, in fact, you were a single person. But if you're somebody who's been married for over a decade, going on 14, 15, 16 years, and this person's in your life, and all of a sudden they're saying, no, you just live separate, like you cut that person away. It is very hard, it's very traumatizing to do that. And especially to,
so they encouraged this type of separation as part of your treatment?
If the spouse felt that it was necessary, yes, they would use it as a punishment if you had any relapse or if they didn't feel safe. So separation or, not enabling, because if even if you felt like having sex, but this was the funny thing is, okay, let me just run down just a quick list of things. Like you talk about things that are damaged. All right. So if you're a sex addict, you're using sex I'll read some of the definitions of sex addiction just real quick, because it tells you like what happens. So I wish I had it right here, but it's basically if you're using sex to escape, if you're using sex as a reward, sex is, you're using it as like an addict. If you're using sex as an escape from bad feelings, if you're using it as a reward for good behavior, if you're using sex as, if you're too focused on the physical aspects of your partner where you're objectifying her, that's addiction. If you are, I'm trying to think of some of the other things, like if you are too selfish, if you're just focused on your own happiness and not your partner, and just using those 4 criteria right there, those are common things where they talk about like sex addicts and how they interact with sex. Tell me how you can be physically, tell me how you can have any kind of normal sex when you're trying to, like, every time you touch your partner, you're thinking of this whole big list of criteria, like, oh my gosh, am I objectifying her? Oh my gosh, is this a reward? Am I being rewarded for good behavior? Am I, is this, am I coercing her in any way? Is she feeling like, that she owes this to me? Like, it just becomes so complex that it really destroys, that's one of the ways that it destroys intimacy,
it's anti what we're supposed to be trying to do, which is relaxing into the experience together and enjoying it and actually using it as a stress relief.
Right. Like all of a sudden here, I've been married for like 12 years and I've always felt like I was, things were pretty healthy. And now all of a sudden I'm like, oh my gosh, I do think these things. And that's some of the teaching. So some of those things, like, even though I was doubting that the therapists were all the way correct, there were some things that were sticking. Does that make sense? So like, it's really confusing because on the one hand, they have all these ways that they describe human nature, basically, like, are you attracted to women visually? Yes. Oh my gosh, well, now what does that mean?
And that's such a horrible way to use the word objectification, because you're exactly right. Both men and women are visual creatures, and we're supposed to be having some type of result from being sexually attracted to another person. So when you use the word objectification just to just to describe a normal part of being a human, that's again making something a disease that's just normal. Objectification should be used when you're not interested in any other aspect of a person's worth or value or anything other than, their body, which already in a marriage, you're way beyond that because you've gotten to know each other.
Right. And that was, I definitely felt that, like, I had to re-explain, like, no, I don't just see you as, an object. And the lying, the way that they just you start looking at every little thing, like, am I a liar because I know I'm going to say I'm going to be home in 5 minutes, but I know it always takes longer than that? Like, am I a liar about that? Like, it really digs into so many different aspects of your life where you start to question everything, because you're just accused of being a lying addict all the time. So what I'm trying to get at is things got worse. Even as I became more sober, things got worse. And as things got worse, ultimately my ex-wife and I were separated for 9 months. She stopped saying, I love you. Much of that is because I feel like she was, I don't want to say fed these doctrines, but I mean,
she felt like she had to have a hard line with you.
Like she had to protect herself from this monster that, had, and that was just hard. That was to feel like that and to love. So like, I loved her. I still do, and it's, but, and when somebody else is telling your wife, what you think about her, and she believes it because they have a degree or something, that's really hard. That's really hard to deal with. And so we were separated. She stopped saying, I love you. She lived in a different state. And when she came back, she cried. She said, I don't want to come back. I don't want to come back. I'm happy living in another state without you. And I just felt pretty hopeless at that point, after going through this for about 2 years, and things just being really rocky. And we got divorced. And I don't know how much, I definitely made some mistakes that contributed to that. But at that point, it was really over. We got divorced. And it wasn't until, after the divorce that I was really able to start looking at things and just saying, this is what I think and what I think really happened about this. And because
what does that narrative look like for you now? Because I know you've shared with me as we were preparing for the interview that you've felt really betrayed by kind of the therapist, the mental health profession in a lot of ways. The help that you were trying to get, you feel actually contributed to your divorce. And that must be a pretty horrible way to be feeling.
Yeah, I mean, I love my wife. I paid thousands of dollars for therapy to try to fix everything we could fix. I listened to them obediently, and I did what they said, and the outcome was things got worse. I actually called one of the therapists that we'd worked with a little bit at one point in a couples counseling, because I wanted to grill him on a little bit about the science behind. I wanted to put him on the spot and say, hey, what do you really believe there's science behind it? And he actually has left the sex addiction therapy clinic that he was with. And he said, you're exactly right. The science isn't there. And he said, I saw, multiple people get worse with the therapy that they were going through. You're not the only ones. He's like, I saw that too. And he's like, and so I give him a lot of credit because he could see that it wasn't working either. So.
Wow.
I guess to sum up, looking back, what I see is, number one, the definition of addiction is so broad that it can capture almost any male with any sexuality at all. So that's the first problem is
and I would add that it can capture females too. It's just we have a different narrative about females.
Right. Yeah.
So we just don't apply it to them. But we have the narrative that men, especially in religious cultures, that men are kind of sexual animals that can barely control themselves. And
right.
If given the chance and not controlled by some outside force of morality, they will act in ways that will be harmful to themselves and their partners. I mean, it's really a very negative stereotype and kind of script that we have for men.
Yeah. The second thing that I just wanted to address was that it's like a drug. There's really good evidence to show that isn't the case. There's the group called Fight the New Drug, which is, an anti-pornography thing. I think it's really dangerous to treat this. And that's the main part of why I'm here, thinking about treating kids. But also other adults who just don't realize that the science isn't there. I mean, I can walk you through this. Well, Nikki is probably one of the best people I actually read several of her studies, and I realized, the ways you can study the brain to realize that, it doesn't show signs of withdrawal, the physical withdrawal like heroin and cocaine do. It just doesn't behave like that. If that were the case, if it was like heroin, if sex was like heroin, when I went to school at SUU, there was these little married apartments. They had single whatever apartments, but then they had these little married apartments, and they were these little things, and all the newlyweds went there, and everybody just, like, within months of getting there, you were going to get pregnant. And they called them the lambing sheds, and I just think, if all these things they say about how it messes with your brain and it just screws with your brain chemistry, how in the world do these married couples that are having sex, these newlyweds, it's a joke, they're having sex all the time, how do they pass any of their classes? How are all these newlyweds that are having sex all the time making it out of college? If they're all hooked on this drugs that is sex. And I just don't, I mean, anyway.
Yeah, that's an interesting point, because I think for some reason we tend to think that married sex is healthy and anything else is unhealthy, but the brain doesn't work that way. You know, like I usually say cocaine or heroin, they don't know that you're Mormon or Jewish or Catholic or atheist or newlywed
yeah,
or anything.
Why is it okay? Why are you an addict if you're 40 and you want sex twice a day? But when you're a newlywed, they're like, they're newlywed. They're
right.
like rabbits. They're just,
right. So real substances that can affect you in that way, the context doesn't matter. They're going to affect you, and they're going to cause withdrawal, and they're going to cause some real issues. Whereas pornography and sex, and they're very much tied to contextuality. And I agree with your concern of fight the new drug and the messages that's giving to young kids, it's really a fear-driven message. And what we know about fear motivation is that it can be effective for the short term, and yet usually isn't effective in the long term. And yet again, I think what's more harming about it is what kids start believing about themselves. So the self-fulfilling prophecies, right? Like, like kind of like you described when you were a young kid, like something wrong with me. I don't have a good brain.
What future do I have?
What kind of, I've already ruined potential sexual relationships with my future spouse that I haven't even met. How's a young single, how is a young adult going to enter their marriage and enter their marital bedroom with these kinds of ideas about themselves, if they have them versus if they didn't have them? Those are really lifelong implications that we're feeding to our children. That's so harmful. And it all comes out of our own fear and our own insecurity and our own misinformation and education around such a, topic that's just very normal for all of us to be involved with.
Yeah, that was you took the next thing I just wanted to share kind of in closing, is that all of those things that they talk about, that, an addict, when they compare it to a cocaine addict, they call it escalation. The addiction escalates. And that's a really scary thing to teach people, because once you label somebody that, now you've got this explosive thing, that's just waiting to become the Dr. Jekyll, Mr. Hyde, or, the Incredible Hulk, where all of a sudden it's just going to start ripping your life apart. And so that becomes just that idea that it can grow like that, like a true drug addiction, is a real terrifying thing. And there isn't evidence that's the thing, is there's not evidence that supports that. There's not evidence that supports that. I haven't seen it. I don't see a study that shows that's true, but that's taught all the time, that it's just like a drug. And that's why it's so damaging. And it makes you terrified. I know that, I know for a fact that my wife became more scared of me. And I even started, there was a point in the low point, I kind of skipped over the real dark end of my marriage. But I started to believe, even though I was questioning, I didn't have the ability I hadn't unraveled the science. It's taken a long road for me to read all the science and to know what I know now. But there's a lot of confusion. There's so much confusion out there, an unbelievable amount. I really think that you believe it. And I started to wonder, am I going to attack some of the studies that they have for sex addiction? They pull from pedophiles, studies of pedophiles. And I should say this, I do believe some people really do have these sexual disorders that are on the criminal level, and they show that they have real mental dysfunctions in certain parts of their brains. And they again, that term conflating, where they take something that's unrelated to pedophilia and they just say, well, pornography is going to be the same thing. Well, there's no science that actually shows that.
That's right. Pedophilia is a sexual attraction to prepubescent children. So it's not even teenagers. So if you're attracted to a teenager who has hit puberty, that's still inappropriate. Maybe you don't want to, the attraction itself may not be inappropriate, but if you do something about it, it's definitely inappropriate. Dealing with a minor, if you're an adult, But prepubescent children having a sexual attraction to them, there's some very interesting research about that. And we also have to remember that many, many people who have that type of attraction never act criminally. So that's another, we can't conflate the attraction to then everybody who has that attraction does something about it.
Right. And I didn't mean to misspeak about that specifically, but just that that's what this addiction model does. And it just takes all these it takes the worst of human behavior. And it's just like, oh yeah, we'll take that, and we'll take that, and we'll take depression, and we'll take, your life's falling apart, and, all these different things. And all of a sudden you really have this horrible view. Like I became suicidal again at one point during that therapy, because I just didn't know who I was saying, I didn't know who these people who are smart were saying, oh, I read their books and it says you're going to become violent. I've got 4 kids. They're my world. And that was a day where you hit this low point where you're like, what do I have to do to protect my family? Do I have to cut my penis off? Do I have to, should I just kill myself? Is that, am I this ticking time bomb? And all these things, and so as I'm absorbing the actual doctrine of the sex addiction model and getting worse, they're making it look like, look, his addiction is just getting worse. Look at how it's affecting him, and to have people believing that and not being able to explain what's going on. Now I look at it and I can say, wow, I really had some messed up ideas. I definitely, the things they were saying were not true. I know the research that what they're saying is not true, but when you don't have the information and the knowledge to combat that, and the people that you're trusting and putting your whole life in are literally giving you the wrong information, and then misdiagnosing, getting back to that where they totally ignored my diagnosis. I gave them the symptoms. I literally wrote them out in a list, and they misdiagnosed something as simple as depression. I know that there's a lot. So I see undiagnosed depression, undiagnosed and treated ADHD. Those are 2 things that I saw, again, in my unprofessional way. I definitely saw huge struggles with that. And it wasn't being addressed at all. It's not being treated at all. They're not, the only mental health treatment they're getting is sex addiction treatment. And that's what I went through. So, which
is not even a treatment. Because it doesn't really it doesn't clinically exist.
Yeah. And there's no, show me one study. I put a challenge out there. Show a study that shows that it's effective. Give me a percentage, 30%, 40%. I can show you 20 studies on which toothbrush is most effective. I can show you 20 studies on the effectiveness of different root canal therapies. I can show you percentages on, how to test and see if a tooth is going to need a root canal. This brings us back to the whole thing where I'm glad in a way that I had this opportunity to go through this, because maybe somebody needed to tell the story, but there is a flood of information about teeth, and I could just literally stack it up of all the research that's been done about dentistry.
Yeah.
And it just blows my mind that these places can exist, and they can put diagnoses out there. They can label people, they can take people's money. And I just don't see that there's science behind it.
Yeah, and I want to just offer that there are lots of effective treatments for either several things I think can be happening. One is that you really do belong to a culture or tradition or religion where the standard of sexual behavior is fairly rigid, okay, or fairly conservative, or whatever word you want to call it. It's going to be a difficult process to kind of tamper your human kind of natural drive behavior to match that type of standard. People do it. people feel like it's more important to have their relationship with their religion or their faith or their culture, and they suppress certain aspects of their sexuality. And again, that's a personal choice. And we as therapists really should not be in the business of even, we can talk about the realistic expectations, we can talk about risks and benefits, but we're not in the business of changing people's religious beliefs. People can do that, but that's not a clinical issue. And it's just going to be hard to do that because you're kind of going against some of nature's kind of hardwired part of who you are as a human being. It's not impossible. There's definitely, monks and priests who've been celibate their whole lives. There's nuns, there's, all kinds of religious people who have, in a sense, said, I'm going to set aside a certain aspect of natural human sexual tendency to follow this path of whatever they want to call that. So sometimes people are just in a wrestle with those two things. And that in of itself can be something that can be helpful to talk to a trained therapist about, especially a culturally competent one, somebody who knows about your religion or your faith tradition, but isn't going to impose their own religion onto you, right? So that's a very, like as a Mormon therapist myself, that's very tricky because I have ideas about my sexual values, but I cannot ethically impose those upon people who don't share my ethical values, or even if they share them, they may be living a very different reality than I live. So I have to make that space very safe to explore what that wrestle is gonna look like for them. So that's one thing. Then there is maybe more compulsive or out of control behavior that for some reason really is causing significant distress. PTSD there's that can be treated effectively. Maybe you've got OCD, maybe you've got clinical depression, social anxiety, PTSD, variety of things that you can get effective treatment for and that requires correct assessment. So I can't tell you the type of therapies because there's 500 different options of what could be wrong, right? And there's 500 different ways to treat those options effectively. Best standards of care. And then there's the possibility that you may be, dabbling in non-consensual or sexual assault type of behavior that is its own kind of entity, which also may have mental health implications as to why that's happening, and also has effective treatments and standards of care to address those kinds of issues. So this isn't, don't do sex addiction and then just go off and live a happy life. Get the help you need, right? Get the help you need to effectively have higher quality of life, good mental health, good relational health, right? Because a lot of the things that you're describing as a marriage and family therapist doesn't seem like good practice to encourage people to separate or, to have really rigid boundaries with each other and not have affection and not encourage, like compassion and empathy for each other's situations. Kind of goes against a lot of the skills I've been taught as just a basic marriage therapist, right? So we want to try to build hope in relationships and make opportunities hopefully for them to have more sex or have more affection or have more verbal, confirmations of each other's positive traits and things of that nature. So even good relational therapy can be a very good thing for people to address betrayal or hurts or how we've wounded each other. And what are we going to do about those wounds? And how are we going to repair from those wounds in ways that we eventually don't have a one up, one down? Because if you've been betrayed, you probably are going to be one up for a while because you're hurt and you're upset. Yeah. And you have a right to be hurt and upset. And I think it's important for a partner who's betrayed somebody to take that one down position and say, okay, I'm willing to be the bad guy for a little bit, right? But if you want to stay together for 20 years, that's not going to work. You need to eventually get to the point where you're back to being equals and where trust can be regained and where you've renegotiated things that maybe you never negotiated to begin with. And that takes a lot of good relational work. So there's definitely options here to help people have the types of relationships they want to have. So I'm not implying that there's nothing to worry about and that people should just go on their merry way. Get the help you need, get effective treatment, get correct assessment.
So if I could just throw in what you just described, that sort of messy process that is reality, that maybe there is an issue of betrayal that it needs to be addressed. There's maybe differences of libido, maybe ADHD, whatever those real issues are. None of those will be fixed with the addiction model, because all it will focus on is, something that it ignores those. It just says that there's one problem with things. So I just wanted to say that I agree with what you're saying, that absolutely, I 100% agree. There was things that weren't perfect with myself, with our marriage. I feel greatly they were ignored and not helped in this addiction model treatment because they were never diagnosed. Just like in that little quote that I read, if you look at porn, you need therapy. And that's where it starts. It's got such a broad definition of it. And anyway, there's not a diagnostic process to it. For me to fix a cavity on a tooth, I have to take an x-ray, I have to examine the tooth. It has to meet certain criteria, and they call it accepted standards of care, right? So it's not just what I think about, but what would, 4 of my colleagues do in that same situation. And if I'm not really well in line with what other practitioners would do, then I could be at risk for malpractice. And then what I choose to, any of those choices, it's just.
Yeah. And I would just, again, remind people that not all clinicians are trained equally. So if I'm going to have cancer, I'm probably not going to go to my family practitioner. Maybe my family practitioner is the person who helped me figure out there was something problematic to begin with. But then they're going to refer me to the specialist.
Yes,
right?
yeah.
And so not all mental health professionals are trained in every single aspect, and very few are trained, really specifically trained, more than just one master's level class in human sexuality.
Right.
So if you have sexual issues, you need to really look for somebody who is trained in sexual health. And I, strongly recommend the association AASECT, AASECT.org. That's where I got my training from. There are some other sex certifications that are kind of Christian based or again, religiously motivated. And I would steer away from those, mainly because they do not hold clinicians accountable to the level that these other ones do. In other words, if you're squeamish about this type of issue because you happen to be a Christian, well, you don't need to get training on that. That's not how medical clinical training works. If your religious beliefs keep you from being a practitioner who can work with a variety of issues, then maybe that's not really the profession for you.
Right.
And and that's an okay thing too, to decide. Lots of people choose professions that, coincide with their faith and their cultural beliefs.
I 100% agree, because in this issue, whether or not you're an addict has a big difference of whether that person you go to is a strong, there is a religious component that's been found, whether someone's, diagnosed or not with that.
There's a huge research supporting this. It just started coming out about, I would say 3 years ago. Joshua Grubbs is one of the people who's been doing a lot of that research, but he's not the only one, and it's been replicated. You want research that is replicated,
right,
and that gets the same results. And what they're finding is that sex addicts primarily come out of religiously conservative cultures. And that's why I know that our Mormon population is very at risk and vulnerable to this type of treatment approach, and why I'm trying to basically be a consumer alert to people who have very good intentions, who want sexual health, who want what's best for their kids, and yet are sending them to these sex addiction treatment centers as adolescents for masturbating, which is highly, highly problematic and will cause your child undue distress and can contribute to suicidality, depression, anxiety disorders. Please do not put your children in risky situations because you're afraid, or you're trying to do your best, but you're not adequately educated about some of these matters. It's very, very problematic.
Yeah.
Oof. so much.
Just that, we just touched on it, but just unraveling all those different certifications, as a lay person, and my background is not in mental health, but I was just shocked how many of those people that were advertising themselves as experts, that they're really only, their sex addiction training amounted to a couple of weekend classes and, some mentorship. I mean, it really, the depth of training just, I didn't, like you said, it just wasn't there. And there can be these people that you think are experts and they really maybe aren't. And I think it's fine to have people who are religious, but if you're getting religion, but you think you're going to a clinician, then I think there needs to be something that changes there, because it is very confusing to know what type of therapist you're going to in the mental health arena.
And it's not appropriate for us as clinicians to promote our religion within therapy. It's very different, for example, for me to say, well, tell me what is helpful for you about reading the scriptures, because maybe you brought up scripture study. So tell me what's helpful about that. And I could ask that of a Mormon person or a Jewish person, right? If they're finding it helpful, I, as the therapist, want to know. So it's not that I can't talk about religion or spiritual practice with my clients. Many clients find spiritual practice very much part of their mental health. So that's wonderful. We want to know as therapists what those things are. It's very different for me to then say, well, why don't you open up to Genesis, 5:2 or whatever. And I think that this would be a helpful scripture for you. That is me imposing my religious experience onto my client. And that now crosses the line of inappropriateness. And that's, I think, what people really need to kind of be wary of. Is it's fine that a therapist, just like anybody, is going to have their own values, their own religion. But is my therapist or clinician imposing their religious values, their ideas of sexual health onto me, when who makes them the expert on that? Is it the larger body that agrees with this?
Yeah. And sorry, but when you said that, what the difference is the difference of whether the person you're dealing with has a disease, or whether you're disagreeing on whether you're, I know that you have a word that's going to make this, barter isn't the right word, but coming to an agreement of what's acceptable in the relationship.
Negotiating.
Negotiating. Well, kind of like barter. Yeah. Are you talking about what's acceptable behavior? So that's I look at how masturbation affects my marriage. Ultimately, it should come down to negotiating what is acceptable in the relationship. And in the end, it's saying, hey, we chose this and he chose this and that. But that's not what happens with addiction. Addiction is, wow, this person was so, his brain was messed up and he became violent and he just objectified people and he just, all those other things that go on that's conjecture, and it's more the religious, the sin next to murder kind of things that come out.
The moral.
The moral. That's it. So.
Yeah. Well, Matt, thank you so much for this interview. Really, I can't tell you how, again, excited I am to be able to talk at this level with somebody who's kind of experienced this firsthand and who, can see, why it was very promising to begin with and why a lot of people could feel that way. And at the same time, you could see how in the end it was very damaging, not only for you, but your ex-wife. And this is what I really hope individuals and ecclesiastical leaders who may be referring to some of these programs and clinicians who may be listening. I'm not trying to throw anybody under the bus, but we have to be really careful, because for many people, dealing with a person's sexuality is dealing with really at the core of a person's identity. And when you start treating somebody like they are a sick individual and diseased individual, that has huge implications. And we do not have the right to do that to people. And it is a form of malpractice there's some real ethical considerations here. And even as a religion, we need to be very careful to not imply that people are spiritually sick, or, as they're trying to meet standards that are very difficult to meet and even sometimes unrealistic, the way that we talk about them, especially for our youth, which is like zero sexual arousal. That really sets people up for ongoing failure. And when you have young kids who feel like they're ongoingly failing at something and being ongoingly unrighteous, this really affects self-esteem, self-motivation. We really need to start looking at this much more critically, because the last thing I know any of us want to do is hurt our own kids.
Right. Yeah.
Okay. Thank you, Matt. Any closing thoughts from you?
It's a huge topic. I would just say a call out to please just understand that the science that supports this is really shaky, or non-existent, but when the people talk to you about it, they're so convincing. They have all these letters after their names. Maybe they're a doctor, and you just assume that they all know what they're talking about. But again, let's not call people a disease that don't have a disease. If it's a disease, show me the evidence that exists. But so much of it just comes from this same source. And I just want people to kind of be aware of that. And for heaven's sake, let's not give our kids diseases that don't exist, and just let people know that there's normal. If I could go back to the suicidal, depressed 18-year-old me and just tell him, hey, it just explained what normal sexual development is for most. Like, it's okay that you're going to experiment with stuff. You're going to meet people that you like and have like some sort of normal sexual development. You're going to kiss. And I hope that's what I hope for my kids, to have a healthy development in their life and not be afraid of themselves, what lurks inside them. So.
Thank you. And I'll just say the last comment that Dr. Prousey put on the Facebook page is we get so many people emailing us, and by us, I'm guessing she means her clinic because she's doing a lot of research with stories like this, who are too embarrassed or scared of being sued to speak out. Thanks for walking through descriptions of the fake experts and the negative effects fraudulent treatments can have. So there you go. All right, everybody, good health, good sex, good life. That's what we're all going towards. So let's try to do the best we can in those directions. And Matt, thank you again for your very generous time tonight. I know it's late here, so hope you have a great week, and we'll keep in touch.
Yep. Good talking to you.
All right. Take care. Bye-bye.
Thanks for joining us today on Mormon Mental Health Podcast. If you enjoyed this episode, please help us and become a monthly subscriber at mormonmentalhealth.org. The goals of this podcast include education, advocacy, and the mental health and general well-being of Mormons and their families. We can't further this work without your support. Music for this episode was provided by the Lower Lights.
Over life's tempestuous sea, chart and compass came from thee. Jesus, Savior, pilot me, unknown ways before me roll, hiding rock and treacherous show, chart and compass came from thee. Jesus, Savior, pilot me.
As a mother stills her child,
ocean wild, wondrous sovereign of the sea. Jesus, Savior, pilot me. Boisterous wave, obey thy will, when thou sayest to them, be still. Wondrous sovereign of the sea, Jesus, Savior, pilot me. When at last I near the shore, and the fearful breakers roar, may I hear thee say to me, fear not, I will pilot thee. Twixt me and the peaceful rest, then while